Okay, so first thing I'm going to talk about quickly is the PCB itself and the stack-up that's involved in the PCB. Obviously, when we transport or transfer our design from the schematic capture phase down to the PCB, then there are certain other things that we need to deal with on the PCB. Typically, and this is just an example PCB, a very simple PCB designed by Dr. Woods here. We can see on the left-hand side we have a toolkit, a design toolbox, and that lists various stacks or various layers of the PCB. And what do we mean by that? Typically, the simplest of PCBs will consist of a substrate of some form, usually what we call fiberglass or FR4, and this is an insulating substrate. And then on top of that we will have a copper layer, which is a conductive layer, obviously. We'll call that the top layer because it's on the top of the substrate. And then on top of that we will have another solder mask layer. And that's the green, typically green, it can be any colour you want, but that's the green bit you see on top of the copper. And what happens is, when the copper is etched away by the manufacturer to create the tracks that we've done on multi-board or our PCB design package, the solder mask will sit in between those copper tracks and create an insulation so there can't be any jumping of electrons, etc. And then on top of that, we will have another little layer, which is what we call the silk screen or the overlay. And that is where you can see these words and symbols and idents all get printed. Now that is a single layer PCB because we have one copper layer here. Yeah, we'll call that the CE. Yeah, one copper layer, single layer PCB, so it'll be the top layer. We can also put another layer on the bottom, another copper layer. Now we have a two-layer PCB. So we have a top layer and a bottom layer. And as you can see on this design toolkit here, you can see a copper top and a copper bottom. So if you want to run traces on the top, then you'll select the copper top and you'll run them. Typically, they will appear in this red colour. If I want to run some, sorry, that's the copper bottom. If I want to run on the copper top, I can double click on there. I can start running wires on the different layer. If I escape out of that, you can see it's a different colour. It matches the colour to represent that is now on the top layer as opposed to the bottom layer. Okay? So now we have a two-layer PCB, and then of course, if we were just happy with this two-layer PCB, then I'd have another solder mask, which we would call, in this case, if this is the bottom layer, this is the bottom solder mask, and then the bottom ident. Yeah, two-layer PCB. And just for your reference, if we take out those last two layers that I've just written on there, and we have this bottom copper layer, what we can actually do is we can have another substrate in there, another insulating substrate, so we'll call this FR4 here, another layer of FR4, and then we can have another copper layer, another layer of FR4, and then a final copper layer. So this would be copper, this would be copper, and then on top of that we would have a silk screen, a solder mask and a silk screen. Now I have a four-layer board. So I have a top layer, I have a middle layer 1, a middle layer 2, and a bottom layer. And you can have as many layers as the fabrication plant can deal with. You know, a motherboard, for example, may have 12 layers or something along them lines. And you can draw copper on each of these layers. So if there's no physical space to get your copper traces on because you run out of room, one of the easy things to do is add another layer. Or typically, you may have one of these layers would be a ground plate, and another one of these middle layers would be a power plate. And so then you don't need to run any grounds or powers on the top and bottom layers, you can just veer into the different middle layers. What's a veer, I hear you ask? Or via, how do you say? Veer or via?
Say via.
Via, okay. So a via or veer is a hole that's drilled from the top, to the bottom, and it makes a connection between the copper layers that are found in between your boards. Yeah? So if I run a track on the top layer, and now I need to connect to something on the bottom layer, because I can put components on the top and the bottom, then I would create a via that would go through the board and make that electrical connection from one layer to another layer. This is a typical via. You can also have what's known as a blind via, which will be one that starts at the top and ends somewhere in the middle. And you can have a buried via, one that starts in the middle and also ends in the middle. So there's 3 types of via that you can have. Again, your fabrication plant that you choose may not be capable of doing all those types, so you need to understand that. So now we know all of this information, yeah, we've done our PCB, we've got little layers.